What is a roguelike? For decades, it was a relatively unknown term for an unforgiving, turn-based, and graphically simple style of game, as seen in Rogue, one of the first games of its kind. The main unforgiving aspect of roguelikes is permadeath. As soon as the player dies, the game ends, and all progress the player has made is lost, and they have to start again from the beginning. Since then, the roguelike genre has evolved significantly, with its codes and conventions changing along the way to cater to a wider range of people than ever before. To start, we'll look at our first case study, Rogue, from 1980. Rogue is a visually simplistic, turn-based dungeon crawler roguelike, which is focused mainly on its ludology, known for its game mechanics, rather than its narratology, the narrative it uses to tell a story. The game doesn't have much story. All the player knows is that they're an adventurer in a dungeon, and if they read a description of the game, they'll know the goal is to find an artifact at the deepest point in the dungeon. Rogue established the foundations for the rules of the roguelike genre with its conventions of permadeath, turn-based combat, and procedural level generation. It set the scene for future games to improve upon the rules it established. These conventions fit Steve Neal's theory on repetition and difference through procedural level generation, which randomizes some aspects of gameplay, which is the difference aspect of his theory, while throughout the game the player's overall objective remains the same, which shows repetition. Rogue fits into Christian Metz's definition of the experimental stage of genre. In this stage, the genre's conventions are established. It doesn't cater to established expectations of genre since it's one of the first games of its kind, and the developers didn't have any conventions to follow. The player types that Rogue would target would likely be the achiever player type. People who are the achiever player type usually get their enjoyment from mastering the game's mechanics and finding the fastest way to complete the game. This can be seen in the speedrunning community. For the uses and gratification theory, the main reason a player would play Rogue is for entertainment. Learning and mastering the game mechanics and eventually beating the game is where they would have the most fun. Due to the nature of the game and its main mechanic, permadeath, the sense of achievement of beating the game comes from the player having done everything correctly from start to finish, despite the game's aspects of randomness. Every move they have made since the beginning has brought them closer to completing the game. Due to the relatively small target audience of Rogue, the impact of Henry Jenkins' fandom theory is small because it didn't generate enough popularity for directly inspired fan content, though the game's audience has made content in the form of videos about the game, which fits his point of fan-made content in some way. As the roguelike genre grew, the community of developers and players of the genre wanted a clear definition of the conditions a game needs for it to be considered a roguelike. The International Roguelike Development Conference, or the IDRC for short, in 2008 was where the roguelike's rules were defined. The outcome of talks at IDRC was a document called the Berlin Interpretation. The conventions of the Berlin Interpretation say that games should have the following conditions: procedural generation, permadeath, turn-based gameplay, grid-based gameplay, non-modal, meaning the game should only have one mode of gameplay, instead of having modes for combat and exploration separately, complexity, meaning the game should make the player think creatively to solve problems. The player might have to plan ahead for some of their moves. Resource management. Players have to manage limited resources such as food and potions to survive. Hack and slash. The main focus is combat and defeating enemies. Exploration and discovery. Players explore the environment and identify properties of unknown items in each new game. Case Study 2. Enter the Gungeon. Enter the Gungeon builds on top of Rogue's experimental stage by using its established conventions of unforgiving permadeath, procedural generation, and adds a unique twist onto its conventions, with its real-time movement and bullet hell mechanics that require players to learn and master another important game mechanic, dodging, while shooting back at enemies at the same time. Enter the Gungeon is mainly ludologically driven. Like the experimental stage, the game lacks a deep narrative due to its permadeath aspect. The game makes up for this with the logbook that players fill out as they go through the game's levels. This logbook, called the Ammonomicon, gives the player the game's narrative through a user interface of item and enemy descriptions. The game also has occasional NPC interactions, such as the shopkeeper. Enter the Gungeon fits into Metz's classic stage because it uses some familiar conventions that began in the experimental stage, but it uses them to turn itself into something that was new and different at the time. It has the same ludological gameplay loop, but also expands on its narrative through UI and NPC interaction. The narrative is the run itself. This contrasts with the next case study, which relies on narratology. The main difference of Enter the Gungeon is the amount of unique guns and items the player can find, collect, and use. It has a small aspect of meta progression, which Rogue doesn't have, for unlocking new items for future runs, but not as much as the next case study. The player types the game is targeting are the Achiever player type, due to having to master the game and its mechanics, and beating bosses. Explorers would also like this game because of the amount of items, NPC interactions, and secrets there are to find. Case Study 3, Moonlighter. The next case study is Moonlighter, where the roguelite subgenre is a deconstruction of the roguelike genre, and it's important to the game's design and how it evolves the genre. Unlike the roguelike, known for its unforgiving system of permadeath, a roguelite uses meta progression, allowing the player to earn persistent and permanent upgrades that don't reset between runs. This difference changes the player's experience for the better, allowing the game's narrative to be clearly told to the player. Moonlighter is a good example of Christian Metz's deconstruction stage because it has aspects of both ludology and narratology. It has the similar ludological style of procedurally generated levels, but doesn't have permadeath. This allows the game to tell a story through its game mechanics, using the player's character's pendant. When the player dies, they're given an option to be sent back to the village, or to enter the dungeon again to retry. If the player dies with items they have collected, they drop them, but the game continues. This narratological aspect of meta progression through ludology is what makes Moonlighter a roguelite, unlike Rogue's unforgiving permadeath mechanic. Moonlighter's meta progression mechanics also allow the player to slowly upgrade their character through unlocking different shops by hiring various village people to work. The game has a unique game mechanic that separates it from other roguelikes. The player's character is a shopkeeper who travels into the dungeons outside the village to find treasure to sell in their shop. The player can also upgrade the size of their shop with coins they earn from selling items collected from dungeon runs. The gameplay loop of being a shopkeeper during the day and an adventurer at night tells the player a narrative through both its story and gameplay. It also relates to the personal identity part of the uses and gratification theory by the player playing the character of an adventurous dungeon-crawling shopkeeper. The shopkeeping aspect of the game can be seen as one of Steve Neal's differences in genre, while the roguelike elements of procedural generation, hack and slash, and exploration have the genre's aspect of repetition. The game appeals to a wider range of battles player types than previous case studies. Explorers are engaged by the procedurally generated dungeons and the notes left behind by lost NPCs. Achievers are satisfied by mastering combat, clearing the dungeons, and earning large amounts of coins from selling items. The game also appeals to socializers through its interactions with the various NPCs who move into the village. Jesse Schell's lens, 23, the lens of motivation, applies here, showing different reasons players engage in games. Intrinsic motivation means the player does something for their own satisfaction, whereas extrinsic motivation is when the player does something for a specific reward. Moonlighter uses both of these methods of motivation for its gameplay loop, satisfying both the Achiever and Explorer types. Moonlighter's dungeon crawling aspect gives the player intrinsic motivation, due to the mystery of exploring the dungeon, fighting enemies, the challenge of mastering the combat, and the feeling of competence they get from these activities. Extrinsic motivation is provided by the shopkeeping aspect of the game, requiring players to sell the items collected from the dungeon in return for coins, allowing the player to progress further into the game through upgrades. These two methods of motivating the player work together, from the player's intrinsic motivation to explore dungeons and collect treasure to sell, which provides an extrinsic reward. This cycle repeats, engaging the player in the gameplay loop. The player's gratification also comes from the player building up their town and watching it become more lively, Henry Jenkins' fandom theory applies to Moonlighter, since the game has grown a fanbase of players who enjoy the game and want to know everything about it. This has led to the creation of the Moonlighter Wiki. The gameplay loop of the game is very YouTube friendly and is appealing to speedrunners too, since they can set goals for others to beat, increasing player engagement through competition.